Welcome everyone to the Centre for Global Development virtual event series. I'm Mark Moran, non-resident fellow at the Centre and senior industry fellow with the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining at the University of Queensland. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever this finds you. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country where I am now located in Brisbane, to the Durable and Jagera First Nation peoples. I would also like to extend this acknowledgement to the traditional custodians where the other panelists are located in Port Moresby, in Makati City in Manila, and in Washington, DC. We have had a last-minute change to the panel as Iri Oliwali has fallen ill. I know you are watching Iri, so get well soon. And thanks to Baya Warapa for stepping in on such short notice. I will introduce Baya and the other panelists before they speak. The panel today will address the promise of adaptive programming at the subnational level in Papua New Guinea, or just PNG as it is known. We will do so with reference to a fascinating part of PNG to its western province, where Australia, via DFAT, or the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has a major and growing aid program in partnership with the PNG government. I have been researching and working in South Fly District of Western Province for the past 5 years. And now I'll do my best to introduce it to you through a few slides. Just give me a moment to share my screen. First, let me say a few things about the independent state of PNG. PNG achieved its sovereignty from Australia in 1975. You can see a map on the right side. You can see its location relative to the top of Australia and its border with Indonesia. Western Province, as the name would say, is at the most extreme western bottom western side PNG, bordering Australia and Indonesia. More than 80% of PNG's 8 million people live in rural areas, reliant on subsistence agriculture, and many are still making the transition to cash economy. In 2011, 38% of the population was under the World Bank poverty line. PNG has got notoriously difficult terrain over mountains, waterlogged plains, and island archipelagos. It is nonetheless classified as a lower middle income country due to mining and other foreign direct investment. There is growing inequality between urban and rural areas. There's a surprisingly high cost of living, and some of these characteristics are similar to resource-rich countries elsewhere. Western Province is really a study of its contrasts. Soils are either parched or flooded through successive wet and dry seasons. Western Province is in a state of constant disaster preparedness. Subsistence gardening and fishing remain dominant with low household incomes, but Western Province is penetrated by national and global supply chains with mining of copper and gold, natural gas, logging, and exotic fish products. Western Province covers a vast area with a very low population density, but it's urbanized above the national average. Due to the remoteness and high cost of transportation, almost all services, markets, and banking are concentrated into the 3 district capitals that make up Western Province and the 1 mining town. There is very little distribution that occurs to a village level in Western Province. Revenues from mining and logging accrue to national and provincial governments. but are insufficient to reach villages. Most village aid posts are closed or derelict, as in this picture of a closed and derelict aid post. You find public servants getting stuck in district centres and not at their posts in villages. The little infrastructure that is there is not maintained and is deteriorating. Roads either don't exist or are impassable by vehicles. Law and justice is largely left to community leaders. And formal governance structures, such as local level governments and ward councils, lack resources and so the authority to lead. Western Province is also characterised by its patchiness. In fact, it's actually a large amount of Western Province is unpopulated, and where people are living is concentrated around 8 population centres. Government agencies have very limited resources for travel, so sensibly they tend to favour the more proximal villages to the district centres. The further you get away from those centres, the less services there are. So much of Western Province does not have frequent contact with PNG government agencies. So private sector, foundations, churches, NGOs fill the gap, but they do so very selectively based on their connections or other reasons as to why they wish to work in certain places. Mining foundations, there are 2 major mining foundations. They tend to do their own thing. They establish their own boards, their own accountability mechanisms, their own delivery structures, and tend to operate in parallel with PNG government systems. So although Western Province is in many ways beyond the limit of the PNG state, it's still very institutionally crowded and somehow governed informally, but in a very patchy, non-uniform way. Western Province is also a borderland. PNG strongly maintained its sovereignty despite its struggles to get government services to reach its most peripheral villages. And interesting, village leaders often step up to help to govern border control. The Australian border to the Torres Strait Islands has been closed since COVID and is dominated by Australian border security concerns. The Indonesian government is keen to promote economic ties, but trade is hamstrung by a lack of border facilities and roads, and current trade is largely unregulated. So Western Province does not enjoy the cross-border trade or labour mobility to the extent that other borderlands do in other parts of the world. Western Province also struggles with pervasive structural obstacles. The biggest example of this is the lack of transport infrastructure and the high cost of transportation. The main way of getting around, due to the extent of waterways, the coast and the major river systems, including the Fly River, is reliance on shallow draft banana boats, which you can see a picture of in the top of this slide. But fuel costs are exorbitant relative to household incomes. Despite PNG being a major producer of oil and gas, the price in the national capital is determined by Singapore prices. Costs contour up across the country due to high transportation costs. The cost in US dollars in Daru is $6.50 a gallon or $1.70 a litre. In inland villages, it becomes as high as $13 a gallon or $3.40 a litre. And you can see in this image the effort to roll the 44-gallon drums of fuel to the boat. Along the border, the price of fuel is double of that in Australia and many more times than in Indonesia, where it is subsidised. Western Province is a place of instability but promise. It has a high turnover of elected officials. 2017 election in South Flight District, there were 54 candidates, and their winning incumbent only received 10% of the vote. It pretty much guarantees that there will be a continued turnover of that member. Maybe not. Western Province is also characterised by its history of big ideas, grand schemes, but high failure, which does not seem to temper people's appetite for big ideas, grand schemes, and which continue to be progressed. It does have growing signs of political maturity, though. People are increasingly wary of political deals and the patronage that have bedeviled governance systems of the past. It does have high levels of human capital. Education is prized. Women leaders and informal networks seem to be rising up, growing, and more formal, less exploitive supply chains are starting to emerge. Just return everything back. So Western Province is not unique in being unique. All provinces in PNG are unique in their own way, as are all country contexts. The purpose of this introduction is to focus the conversation to follow, which brings us to the promise of adaptive programming at the subnational level of PNG. Each of the panelists will now speak to this topic, after which I will then put up a series of questions to them. We will then finish the event by answering questions you submit. By commenting on YouTube, you can also tweet us at CGDev or email us at events@cgdev.org. I will introduce the panel before each of them speak. First, Baya Warapa is a research associate with the Development Leadership Program, where he is undertaking research into informal leadership in Western Province. He is based in Daru, nearby to his home village. Baya is also very active in administering his parish for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he has in the past worked for World Vision and Murray Stokes. Over to you now, Baya. Clearly, there is more capability in Western Province than what first meets the eye. Arriving in a village, as you have done many times, and you are from Buzi village, arriving in a village, the one formal body, the Ward Development Committee, often has not met for quite some time. So it's pretty easy to conclude that there's not much happening or no governance occurring. But can you tell us your experience of how informal organisation and leaders operate at a village level in South Fly?
Thank you, Mark, and the rest of the panel here. You know, when you arrive in a village in Western Province, the immediate thing is that, you know, when the Ward Development Committee is not functioning, you will immediately see other informal, you know, committees coming into place, and, you know, they will be the ones to meet you, and they will be the ones to introduce you and tell you how the village is functioning, how leaders are doing their things, and sometimes they may talk a little bit at the back of the Ward Development Committee, but that is an indication of there is some kind of leadership still existing even when the main one is not there.
And I think, what about women leaders and their networks? I mean, are they really, they're often not as visible as male leaders, but are they really powerless?
The recognition of women leaders in South Fly has, you know, in the recent past has become very prominent now. Because previously you would have men, you know, meeting visitors and, you know, leading out in village, organizing things and all that, like feasts and all those things. But now you will see the leaders, women leaders are more vocal now, and they're trying to pick up the role where men is going down in, and they try to fill in the gap there for the men. So it's just like the men and the women are now beginning to cooperate, while not in a very formal way, but there is that little bit of the men continue to look down on women as leaders, but the tide is beginning to change now.
And I know if Eri was here, she has many times pointed out to me and other people that although a male leader can be the spokesperson, that there's often a whole process of consensus and agreement among women before that public speaking occurs. But back to you, Baya. Can you also tell me, it's often the case in South Fly that people seem very reluctant to speak up in meetings.
That's right, Mark. This is something I think it's more over the years that has happened for the people in South Fly. They're a little bit of timid, and they don't openly speak up in public meetings, especially when visitors are coming and people from outside their own communities. They tend to be more reserved, but that does not mean that they don't know how to do things. I think the better way to getting to them is not in big meetings, but you go and start to talk to them in the sites, and you can actually get into their minds. They will be able to tell you exactly what they are able to do.
Yes, and I also with the conversations you and Eri, just how much time you actually spend talking to people on the side and on the weekends to actually get what they have to say when they won't often speak up in formal settings. Okay, so we're going to change now over to Andrew. Andrew Parker is a freelance development economist with over 30 years of working in large aid organisations, including the UNDP, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, where he has repeatedly positioned himself at the forefront of participatory rural development and innovative decentralisation programs. So Andrew, reflecting upon Western Province and this particular context, what are the types of development approaches that can be appropriated and applied to this particular context?
Thanks, Mark. And thanks also to you and Baya for setting the scene very well and thoroughly in Western Province. And so this is to talk a little bit at the other end of the spectrum as we sit in our offices in Washington, DC, or in Manila or Port Moresby, wherever it may be, trying to design programs, development interventions that can actually help in contexts like Western Province. And I think there are a couple of things that occur to me. One is, and you've highlighted this, that it's not for want of trying in Western Province that there have been a lot of players who've attempted to provide development support, but that history of failure hasn't served the province very well. Cookie cutter approaches, top down, silver bullet, we have the solution approaches really don't work. So we need to get to grips with complexity and some long-standing stereotypes which you've talked to Baya a little bit about, that there's a presumption that there's not much capacity at the local level, that there aren't economic opportunities for people that they can take advantage of, and this is clearly not the case. This rather reflects on our inability, often as development organizations, to find the right kind of approaches. And I think it's clear that the standard playbook is not the one to consult in contexts like Western Province. And as you've mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to work for quite a large number of international organizations, and in each of those, there are always spaces that you can work in that give you the space to try new things. You know, while I worked at the World Bank, I was a member of the community-driven development group of practice, which is probably one of the primary instruments that the bank uses to find ways to get resources down to local communities. Working for the Australian government on the Coalitions for Change program here in the Philippines, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in terms of thinking and working politically. At UNDP, I had the good fortune to be involved in the early stages of setting up what's called an accelerator lab here in the Philippines. And in ADB, they have a very flexible technical assistance program that can be tapped to try out new approaches. So it's not that there aren't ways to find, different, to draw on different capabilities. In a place like Western Province, I think then if it's not going to be prescriptive top-down approaches, how do we cope with the fact that many of our organizations expect project designs, program designs to be very clearly specified up front and not leave you very much room for adjustment as programs move into implementation? And I think, you've talked with Bayer really about the importance of upfront analysis to understand institutional and political contexts. And that's really where the effort needs to be, working in a province like Western Province to really understand those local dynamics, so that when programs do come into play and resources and support are delivered at the local level, they build on those local capacities. They don't undermine them. They're very judicious in their use of financial resources, enough to make headway, but not enough to disrupt processes. And I think that's the point at which we're at now in terms of trying to find new ways and new approaches to support development in Western Province.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Sandra Naranjo Bautista, who is the CEO and founder of Better Goals, a platform of tools and resources for public servants to enhance policy implementation. Sandra is a public policy specialist who has consulted at DFAT and the World Bank. She also has an impressive experience in her own country, Ecuador, where she was a former Minister of Tourism, then Minister of Planning and Development, and then the Vice President. Sandra, there is now quite a bit of work, effort happening around these new adaptive approaches. Can you just talk to the promise of those and your experience of these and introduce us a little to these new approaches?
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much. A pleasure. So let me start. There are three things when I think about adaptive approaches that I wanted to share. So the first one is that, and I think Andrew talked a little bit about this, is that adaptive programming, it's common sense. The problem is that it's not common practice yet. And so for any of us working in development, we probably relate, and it's a no-brainer, right? You have to understand the context and you have to be flexible and adaptive, and like it all sounds very good. The problem is that I think we still have a job to do in making that happen. And I think if we think about it, like now every single human planet can relate when we think about COVID, for example, of how of an uncertain situation we live in, right? And so it's so hard to predict what would happen tomorrow with vaccines, with treatments, and that level of uncertainty that now we are so familiar with, and where it's obvious that we would have to adapt as we go and as we have more information, is the same kind of like, perhaps not at the same magnitude, but it's kind of like the same that it's happening in development, in the sense that there are times where we deal with complicated issues. Say, for example, we want to build a bridge. And so of course it requires some logistics, engineering, and capacity, but if you have the resources, you probably can get it done. But most of the time, we're dealing with complex issues where we're dealing with behavior changes, we're dealing with people, we are dealing with things that are changing all the time, where we don't know the answer, where we need to try and adapt. And I think that's kind of like what these type of approaches are asking us to do. And that's why I think we all recognize the effectiveness of it. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that, at least for me, adaptive programming, it's not a set of procedures that we have to follow or like a particular methodology or trend. It's more a change of mindset. And I think this change of mindset can be beautifully summarized by a quote of Heifetz that says that there is no such a thing as a broken system. A system is designed to give the results that it gives. And so essentially, I think it changes completely our role as development practitioners when we are not trying to fix a system, but rather understanding it first, and only then try to find solutions. And I think that is the basis or the essence of adaptive programming, trying to understand the local context. And I think both Baya and Andrew referred to that. Be flexible and aware that things can change and that development is non-linear and that we need results. And that while there are different approaches, I think that's what all of them have in common. And finally, I think I wanted to close with something important, that is that the best way we can do to help the countries is help themselves for the long run. And the best example I find is from Haiti, and CGD actually has done a beautifully work recommending it, documenting it. But when the earthquake happened in 2010, Haiti was already a poor country. It got about $6 billion in aid, which was the equivalent to the GDP, but the country only managed 1%. So essentially, there was a parallel state, sometimes more powerful than the government, but when the money is finished, nothing happened. And I think that is what we are trying to avoid, right? Create the capacity in country and having that belief that people are willing and they know what to do. And so a little bit trusting the people in country. And I think that's one of the most, the best contribution we can do in terms of adaptive programming.
Thanks, Sandra. And I think that certainly speaks to Western Province, where there really is a tendency to find workarounds around what is seen as dysfunctional institutions. But really, the only way that can be forward is to invest in the governments of that place, which in Western Province in particular includes the Fly River provincial government and the district administrations. Thank you for that. All right, so now we're going to move to Jeff. Jeff King is a development practitioner who has worked at DFAT for 15 years, with long-term postings to the Philippines and currently PNG, where he is the Councillor of Justice, Accountability and Subnational. He has strong expertise in governance programming and is a strong proponent of adaptive programming and politically informed approaches to development. And so, Jeff, what are the challenges of adaptive programming and place-based programming from a policy perspective, from where you sit?
Thanks, Mark. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The challenges from the perspective of a bilateral donor are quite large. So bilateral donors are, and oftentimes multilateral donors, are structured around a paradigm of sectoral programs. So health, education, infrastructure, which we're all familiar with. And the traditional approach that is deployed, as we all know, it's a simplification, but it's a linear sort of A to B. We largely pretend we know how we're going to get to our outcomes, and then we implement. The reality is that rarely happens. Things change rapidly, but it's a starting point. But that's the paradigm. So what we're asking people to do in a place-based approach is we're asking them to think about how we can bring our resources together in a particular area and break down the silos between those various sectoral programs so that we get more bang for our buck and we have a larger impact and are more reflective of the context. And naturally, sectoral programs, which are usually nationally oriented, are resistant to that. They have their own, they have their own theories of change, their own reference points for what they're trying to achieve, and then they're defensive. So it's an uphill battle. And then when we layer on an adaptive approach where we say, we're going to try and work in a way which is flexible, where we're not going to pretend that we know how we're going to get to our endpoints, that we're going to learn as we go. It just adds another level of complexity. And then finally, the last challenge that we're confronted with is bringing our counterparts along. So, we're talking about operating in a way which oftentimes is very politically informed, and we're navigating politics and relationships in a way that most traditional programs don't. And this really can put a donor in the position where we could be accused of, interfering in the domestic affairs of the sovereign country. And so we have to be very careful in terms of how we approach these methods. And I think that from our perspective, from a donor's perspective, the bilateral relationship is the most important thing. So, and the aid program needs to work to help improve and increase the strength of that relationship. So there's a lot of challenges. Now, I'm going to leave it there, but it's not insurmountable. It can be done. As Andrew said, there's always space to make these things happen. I think we can talk later about how that happens. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think it's really important that we just remain cognizant of the limitations of what we can, do in terms of funders. So thank you for that, to bringing us to ground. Okay, so we're now going to go through, I'm presenting the panel with a series of questions, and I'll be asking panelists, different panelists to respond. So the promise of adaptive practice, it really is that, frontline workers, whether PNG government workers or aid workers working alongside them, that they somehow have what it takes through hard work and working things out incrementally, that they can adapt and innovate their way through complex problems. But as I spoke about in my presentation, Western problems also is struggling with these pervasive structural obstacles. I mean, I gave the example of fuel, but there are others as well. So what do we do here? Can we, surely there's a limit to what we can ask people to do. So I'll first put this question to Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. And well, yes, I mean, when you're talking about some of those major structural issues, and you've talked about the fuel challenge that people face in Western Province, also the infrastructure challenges are huge. There's a tendency to kind of imagine that opportunity doesn't exist and people are not pursuing entrepreneurial efforts to provide for their families and their communities. And of course, that's not true. The reality is that people have to find ways and are finding ways to deal with those structural constraints and be able to earn a living. But in doing so, they face enormous challenges. And I think to go back to your point earlier about big, grand dreams as big and fast solutions can't be the way to go. One has to take a very gradual, but it doesn't prevent you from being ambitious, but a gradual approach towards improving opportunities that are already there. And you've mentioned the fact that people are trading across the border there, for example, with Indonesia, but that trade faces its own bureaucratic and administrative difficulties. That accessing Australian markets is often a challenge for producers in Western Province. So looking at ways, some structural constraints are extremely difficult to change, like the geography, but other things are more amenable to change. And I think working through an analysis that helps us to understand where some of those sticking points are, and creating conversations that between governments in different countries, or between national government agencies in PNG itself, to bring to light some of the challenges that people face. And I think for development organizations, it's really this bridging role that is very important. So how do you connect to those village capacities that Baya talked about at the beginning, which are there, but they struggle, they're nascent? How do you bring those capacities along while being able to introduce some external resources to do that without disturbing the status quo and running into some of the problems that Jeff just talked about? It requires a balancing act, and it's obviously not an easy thing to do, but I think that's really at the core of it, finding ways to support those local institutions. And that doesn't just mean financial resources, although those are very important. And many of the things that we're talking about in Western Province, and you mentioned in your opening remarks, we're talking about essential services for people in villages to be able to access. And in many village contexts in Western Province, those services simply don't exist. It's not that they exist in a not very good form. They often really don't exist at all. And so people have to travel very long distances to access even the most basic of health services or education services. And so these are the realities that we need to program around. Thanks, Mark.
That's great, Andrew. So, effectively, I think it is important. I'm always surprised, and this is some of the research that Baya and I are doing, just the level of initiative and innovation and agency, if you like, that is already occurring in places where it's often assumed there is none. So this, I think, bridging between this agency and trying at the same time trying to tackle some of these structural obstacles is really the space that I think I heard you just talk to now. Just Jeff, can you add to this as well?
Sure, Mark. So, look, not all problems are created equal. Everything doesn't have to be adaptive. And some problems are better dealt with at the national level than at the local level. So, I think really, when we're talking about our expectations on local actors for change, it's dependent on the problems that we're trying to address. So within that, the job of a donor is, and working with these kind of adaptive approaches and a place-based approach, the job of a donor is to empower and facilitate local actors to solve problems. We don't solve problems. Our job is to bring resources, knowledge, expertise that can assist local actors, or if it could be provincial or national or a combination thereof, to solve issues. Now, so Sandra talked about this. We're oftentimes in development dealing with wicked problems, complex problems. And the evidence is clear after decades and decades that traditional approaches at best have very mixed results. So that has resulted in some very creative thinking, which is we've seen these new approaches emerge, thinking and working politically, doing development differently, adaptive programming. And the evidence is emerging that there can be success using these approaches. It can make a difference in terms of these wicked problems, but it's a lot of hard work. It's extremely hard work, and I think the key from a donor perspective is to give, is to commit to these approaches and do so in a way that, as I said, empowers and facilitates local actors. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question, and then I'll go straight back to you, Jeff, and then to Bayer, and then to Sandra. So let's talk more. You started this just now, this conversation. So what can development systems do, or shouldn't do, to enable this frontline adaptation that we're looking for? To you, Jeff.
Yeah. Look, it's a big challenge for donors, as I said. So our role is to empower and facilitate, as I said, local actors to make change happen. From a donor perspective, there's a lot of risk around that. As I said earlier, we could be seen as interfering in the domestic affairs of the sovereign nation. So it's important that we have the support of counterparts. But at the same time, in any reform effort, there's going to be winners and losers. And, that contention is going to play out politically, especially in an environment where there's lots of rent seeking, which, there is in PNG. So we have to walk a very fine line in terms of, our support, which is, enabling others to move forward with reforms. At the same time, being cognizant of the risks that, we can't be seen to be doing things that will result in damage to our bilateral state-to-state relationship. So, it's not easy, but it is possible. One of the key challenges, I think, also is within donors, you have to navigate the political economy here. And to do that successfully, you're going to be working but you're going to have to bring along sectoral areas which are going to be very reluctant to change their way of operating. And you're going to need strong authorizing agents. So there's a range of things you need to do internally, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Jeff. So, Bayer, over to you. Just remember to unmute your mic. This is something that's very live for you and I at the moment, as with the research that we're doing. So, in terms of development assistance, what are the problems that happens when money comes into to village in local contexts, and the sorts of qualities that people are looking for in development workers when they are arriving in the village? If you could just talk to that. Thanks, Bayer.
Thank you, Mark. I think Sandra had mentioned of this. Whenever we intervene into a certain community in South Fly or in Western Province for that matter, the biggest thing that donors or NGOs would have to understand is that they're dealing with not just a development initiative that they're tasked to do, but it is also, first of all, the mindsets of the people. And I think that is the biggest challenge in every development initiative, the mindsets of the people. And probably that is from my own experience as a local from here and my involvement with working with NGOs, that is the biggest challenge that I've seen. That the mindsets of the people is something that if we don't really make them move on with the initiatives that we are trying to bring across, they can go the way around because they think you're not there for them. So then the question that you asked about, how can the leaders be able to, still be able to manage in the villages despite the challenges there. Well, Lord Mark, you see, it's about being resilient to the people, and when they see that they don't have the basic things in life, these are human beings, they become resilient in a way so that they can be able to live from their own. And that's what makes them to continue to survive and continue to move on in communities, even when assistance is not there.
Thank you. It's good to bring it to that reality. So to you, Sandra, now, so maybe specifically to the political process and the need for an authorizing environment.
Yeah, I think just to add what like Jeff and Baya was saying is that it's much easier said than done, right? So once you arrive there, I think if something you only are aware of how little you know and how much things are said without being said. Baya was talking at the beginning of like how it takes time for like people to be open and tell you what's really going on. And I think the art of being like humble and to listen what people have to say, like what are the things going on. It's something that we get better with practice. And I recently heard an analogy, and I think I will share it because I think it summarizes very well, perhaps, this calibration of the policies that we want to do and the standards that we want to set and sometimes even impose, and then the reality of the country. And I heard this from Land Pritchett, actually. So he was talking about it as if you imagine you are in the status quo and you want to increase it to one level and you have like a magnet. And so if the magnet is close enough to the reality, it's possible that it can kind of like push the reform up and you can obtain the level of change that you want. But if there is such a big of a gap, the magnet would have no effect, right? So it's part of this calibration of like, what type of reform is the right one for the context that you are in such a way that it will actually move things. And so that is also an understanding of the level and the situation. And perhaps that means going gradually and slowly and then only increasing over time. And that's okay too. And I think sometimes in development, we have to make peace with ourselves that change happens slowly and incrementally in a non-linear way.
Thanks, Sandra. And I think also for myself, I'm always really surprised by just how naive development workers are in terms of how they fundamentally just change the political economy of a place. You know, people will turn up, there's a big public meeting, they assume that they happen every day of the week. Well, they don't. They're happening often because you're there and you are the bringer of resources. And the people that are standing up and talking at those events are often positioning themselves. And, you know, that can have putting, you know, the worst case example of just putting money into these places can actually have a negative effect and do harm. But there are other ways, and there are positive examples of this, such as the World Bank's Rural Service Delivery Program, where the processes have been worked out through community development and training and other things, where the end result is that leadership and governance is strengthened, and the procurement is handled very carefully, where control and decision making is made locally, but it's more materials arriving rather than money being dispersed. So there is I think that's really important also to remain aware of that. Okay, so let's move now on to the next question, which is really, we're placing a lot of expectations on the capacity of frontline workers, whether P&G government, outside aid workers, private sector actors, church pastors. You know, this working in this adaptive and understanding the context, thinking and working politically, it's pretty hard. And you do at times run the risk of getting embroiled in local politics if you're not careful. So this is a highly skilled job, and you need to be committed there to do it for the long haul. Now, the leaders that are there are already committed for the long haul, but for the people coming in, that's a different story. So how do we actually find effective frontline workers? And then, or the ones that are already there, how do we develop their capacity, the capacity of the outsiders coming in, and actually incentivize them to stay in their jobs for long enough over the long haul? Jeff, I might put this to you again. I know this is a topic that you feel that you've spoken about in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Look, I think in many ways this is the biggest challenge to working place-based and also adaptively. So we need people who have a pretty rare skill set. So we're looking for change agents with hopefully with existing networks that are run deep throughout the community or the region. We're looking for people who have really, really good soft skills. They're very adept at forming relationships and bringing people together to work on issues. They're conveners. It's a huge challenge there, and so Ire, who isn't here today, unfortunately, but she's a great example of a person like that. And and there's just not many of them that are out there, and it's an open question whether you can develop these people over time and how much time it takes. So yes, it's a big challenge. Now, I think once you've identified these people, you need to give them the appropriate environment, and which will keep them there and also will empower them. So really, you're talking about a couple of key things from my perspective. One is autonomy. They need to have a level of autonomy within boundaries, but for decision making and also resource allocation, and they do need resources. So oftentimes the resources are not the issue, but they do need sometimes financial or other resources, and those often those are important as well. But the main thing is they need autonomy to operate so that they can, as Lant Pritchard says, crawl the design space. They can go out and actually understand the local context. They can make decisions around changing direction, what's working, what's not. They can identify opportunities, and that's that will keep them around. If you give them that kind of environment, they'll stick. They'll stay. One of the challenges is when people change, as often happens in donors and by other authorizing agents, someone will come in who has a different methodology, which is more command and control, and that will push them away. So really, it's about the people both that you can attract into these roles, but also the people who are providing oversight and management to create the proper environment that will empower them and keep them focused and interested in staying. Thanks, Mark.
Andrew, could you add to that? Thanks.
Yes, Mark. I mean, with those extraordinary people in place that Jeff is talking about, how does kind of daily life proceed from there? And often we can be talking about quite what are fundamentally quite simple activities, but in practice, given the context that people exist in there, it's difficult to do. So convening people to come to the meeting to discuss a topic of importance, having discussions about what should be on the agenda. What is the purpose of the meeting? That public transport is not very widespread in Western. You have huge issues with weather and the condition of roads. So essential elements of typical decision-making processes can be very difficult to put into action. And I think that's where the sort of interlocuting role if that's a word, that these extraordinary people can play in bringing people together. And to go back to the bridging point, that this is also a space where you can bring together, these interlocutors can bring together state and non-state actors. So you talked at the beginning about the role of women's organizations in villages. These organizations are typically not formal organizations, but they're very important organizations, and they can influence and even direct conversations when they're given that opportunity to do so. So creating spaces where organizations, informal organizations, can be part of formal conversations is an important way of drawing on those capabilities and giving that lift that Sandra talked about, right? This is an achievable magnet that with a bit of help and support can push things forward in the context of village conversations. And also, I'm not sure if you touched on this earlier, I can't recall, but one of the institutions at a village level that has proved incredibly dynamic and resilient is the role that village courts play. And we might think of these as sort of settling, trivial neighborhood matters. But actually, in a context like Western Province, they take on a very critical role in creating spaces for different voices within communities to be heard. So one really has to kind of get creative about looking at the capacities that are out there, and that takes us back to the point that we made at the beginning, which is that you really do need to take some time to understand local context in enough depth to be able to move forward. Thanks, Mark.
And you did one point, refer to Sandra, so I'll put Sandra on now. So Sandra, especially if you could give us a bit of an insider's view from your years of working in Ecuador, and also when you've worked in PNG, you told me how you always gravitate more to the PNG government position. Often, it's one thing for development workers to be adapted, but what's it like? There's challenges as well for national governments here, given that they're often they're authorizing the environment to be adaptive. Could you speak to that, please?
I think one of the biggest lessons I learned working in government is that you will be surprised how much capacity there is, right? And so before we were talking about these like particular individuals that suddenly shine, and sometimes that's because those that have the courage to speak up. And so I remember when I used to start in an organization, I like to do a meeting with everyone in the team. And many times I was surprised of all I remember one time in particular where I was like they had such brilliant ideas. And I was like, why haven't you done this before? Like, you clearly understand the problem, you know what to do, what happened. And someone told me, well, you are the first one that is asking us what we think. And so I think sometimes our role, either if you are working in government or as a donor, it's creating that space so that people will be willing to share. And I think something that I've learned through the years is that you'll be surprised how many people have all these ideas that they actually know, when perhaps are kind of like waiting for that final push or that authorization to make things happen. And I think that's on us, depending which is your role. And that's something very easy that we can do. And generally, when you do that, then more people are willing to talk because they are like, oh, they are listening and they are like taking action, and that will also attract more people. And I found that very valuable. And actually, when I went to PNG and we were doing the surveys and the interviews as part of the evaluation we were doing, again, like when you ask people, they told us, and once they know you are listening to them, they will be more open and you will learn a lot more. So I think in essence, we learn to ask better questions and create the space for people to speak up.
Thanks, Sandra. So, and Baya, now to you. I mean, this is a live question for you with the research that we're doing. I'm asking village leaders, what are the qualities that they respect and want in the people that are coming in to help them in the aid workers? And you yourself have got personal experience about that. Can you specifically give us that, that insight of you? You're on mute. That's it.
Okay, Mark. It's every time there is an intervention into a community, the community always will have expectations of the people that are coming into the community. Whether it's just government delivery service or it's an intervention by aid organizations or any form of aid that's coming into the community. And their expectations is how they measure the outside organizations coming in, whether they are there to help them or they're just there to do their one-off thing and they're off and gone and they just leave us like that. So that's the expectation of the people, and they have their own measuring lines, to measure these organizations by. And so they would want to see people who can maybe behave like themselves, not in the sense that they're doing bad things, but just go and, like, if the villagers are going to fetch water and draw water from a well, they'd rather walk with them because that's the reality of life there. And if the villagers are trying to do something that's not done in town, and you've got to be there present to actually experience it, and the kind of life they're living. And because if that doesn't happen, the villagers will start to measure which one is the best one, and this also creates an environment for competition between aid organizations coming into the villages, and that becomes a problem because then the villages become selective of whom they favor to intervene into their community, and sometimes they can go a little bit aggressive and withdraw the support from the organizations that are coming in to support them there.
Yes, it is just incredible, isn't it, how clever people are about how they actually are playing the situation. But also, I'm just really just recently recall one of the interviews that we did, and a woman telling us two things. One is that people really show respect and listen, and secondly, whether they can actually deliver and whether they will actually, remain involved for the long term. Okay, look, thanks very much. It was a really good question. We're going to get on to the last questions, prepared questions, which is how can we take funders with us, given their low appetite for risk often and high appetite for measurable metrics that demonstrate impact when we're in this adaptive, place-based thinking and working politically space. Andrew, I might put that to you first.
Yes, thanks, Mark. It's a very good question, isn't it? So a few things. You had me down in the intro as an entrepreneur. I wouldn't want people to think that I'm a sort of a startup type of entrepreneur, but more of a policy type entrepreneur. And I think, the point here, something that I've learned very well from my good friend Jaime Faustino at the Asia Foundation, is that one can take an entrepreneurial mindset, to use a phrase also that Baya used earlier. And what does that mean? That means, thinking about things in terms of small bets, placing small bets. Don't bet the farm. Don't put your eggs all in one basket. These right, that in complex contexts, in places that we don't know very well, we better not put everything all on, put it all on one idea. Let's try out let's test, let's see what works. Things that show promise, let's stick with those. Things that don't, let's let them go. Let's failing fast. That's another strongly used phrase from entrepreneurship. What does that mean? Well, the other side of that coin is learning quickly. So it's all right to fail. It needs to be all right to fail, not in a big way, but in a learning kind of way. And that's why we've stressed in the conversation today that money, financial resources are important, but they need to be provided in context, and we need to learn from those experiments as we go along. And we also need to be clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve. Jeff mentioned this earlier, that the whole point about adaptive programming, it isn't, yes, we want flexibility, but we need to be clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve. So that theory of change. Now, the theory of change itself may change as we go along. So those are the feedback, the learning loops that we want to have in place. And the point that you raise about funders and impact, this connects to being clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve, and thinking through the kinds of measures that we can use to unpack that notion of impact. And I might last point is that in the world of social enterprise, this is very much a live conversation. Impact measurement is a very important area that people are trying to think through, and that's because you have a lot of funders, a lot of people with capital who are interested in investing in organizations that are trying to do good, trying to do many of the things that we've spoken about during the conversation today, but want to know how their investments are doing. And the typical M&E approach that we would use for infrastructure projects is clearly not the right way. The sort of the input-output way of looking things is not going to get you to where you need to go. So we're focused on results, we're focused on outcomes, and we need new ways of thinking through how to measure impact. And there are, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, now there are various organizations that are attempting to create sets of metrics, common sets of metrics that can be used to help us unpack the idea of impact and how you apply it in these sort of imaginative and creative programs that we've been talking about today. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think that some of those are called actionable metrics, aren't they? Which enable people who are in this adaptive incremental learning process to know whether the last thing that they've tried is working or not, so that they can adapt in real time. Sandra, I might ask you now, from your experience in working in government, how do we take funding with us?
I think that's the challenge, right? How do we go from the theory to the practice? Because I think we probably all talk about being adaptive, and I can think of like three things. So one is budget, like how are you flexible in terms of the budget, and going back to the entrepreneurship that Andrew was talking about. So for example, Google, they allow to allocate their employees 70% of their time for their core function. 20% they can do other things within the company, and 10% they can do anything they want, any crazy idea they have. So I was thinking perhaps we could adopt like a similar approach, and if you put it in budget and then you say, well, let's go, and so then the change is incremental, right? And so we say, let's go with a percentage of the budget that we go like in the traditional way. Let's go with something where we are more flexible, and let's have a percentage, even if it's small, where you basically try anything and you make peace with your mind that you can fail. The other part is results. And so if you're willing to be flexible and adaptive, and Andrew was talking about like we have to learn to fail quickly, that means that projects are going to fail. So perhaps the metric of the evaluation shouldn't necessarily be a project, but perhaps a portfolio of projects. So that way you give more space or like flexibility in terms of like, if things go wrong, then how are you going to measure and incorporate that? And the other thing perhaps to think about is timing, because we know that like these wicked problems or these complex challenges take time, and perhaps they won't fit within the 5-year or 4-year of a program. And so to think of how we can incorporate these short-term results and how to be more flexible in that sense and more realistic in the type of change that we want and the type of change you are looking for, and then the type of projects that we have given the time space. So the 3 things I would be thinking of.
That's great. So I'll pass now to Jeff. But just to all the panelists, we do have a question to answer, which is in the chat. Maybe you could have a quick look at that and self-select as to who wants to answer it. Over to you, Jeff. Final word, taking funders with us.
Yeah, so from a funder's perspective, look, that's the first thing you need is an authorizing environment to work in this way. So that means when you say authorizing environment, you're talking about a senior decision maker who empowers you to try new things. And we've had that in Western Province. Our High Commissioner here at the HICOM is, he's effectively given us the space to work in a place-based approach and also adaptively. Now, it's much easier to work in a traditional approach where, from a delegate's perspective, because you have some sense of what's going to happen, how things will play out. It will change, but the risks can be foreseen. Of course, the reality is if we use a traditional approach, it's not as effective as we discussed. So you want to do something that's adaptive. You really, you're saying to a delegate, someone has to sign off on a large amount of money, and you're saying, we know where we're going to start and we know where we want to get to, but in terms of the middle, we're not sure, and we're going to learn as we go. That doesn't provide them with a lot of confidence. So it's incumbent upon people who are designing these programs to ensure upfront that the governance and the risk management processes and systems are extremely rigorous and robust, so that the delegate can have confidence that, yes, we're going to learn as we go. Yes, we'll be flexible, but there's going to be oversight and engagement along the process. We're not looking to command and control. We're giving people autonomy to take action and to move forward in directions as they learn. But at the same time, we're going to be aware of what's going on so that when risks are emerging, we'll see them early and be able to ensure that we manage them appropriately. So that's absolutely key. And then we've had a lot of discussion around a portfolio approach, and I completely agree with that. And we've also already talked about not everything has to be adaptive. So, you can have a mix. But if you are gonna deploy this approach, there's going to be skepticism. So, when we worked on Coalitions for Change, had a saying, "You're only as good as your last reform." So, you really, the way that you earn the right to work in this way is by delivering. And when you're talking about wicked problems, as Sandra said, can take a long period of time. So you need to definitely have a portfolio approach, which ensures you're going to have some things that you can deliver. And it's okay to fail, that's fine. But at the same time, you've got to be able to have some things that you can tick over to ensure that you're delivering, you can demonstrate results. And then the final thing I think I wanted to mention is you need a compelling rationale. So you need to be able to explain why we need to use this approach in the particular context that we're looking at. So if you look at Western Province, it's 4 kilometers from Australia across open water. It's at its nearest point. It's our nearest neighbor by far. It has the largest disparity of any border in the world in terms of economic indicators. The per capita GDP, it's something, I can't remember the exact number, but something like 20 times is the difference across the border. And, and there's a compelling rationale there, right? So from a development perspective, it's certainly in Australia's interest that PNG develop. Because if we don't see that happen, if we don't invest into that space, there are risks to Australia. One would be disease. Another would be potentially things like people smuggling, drugs, guns, those kind of items that are trafficking, transnational crime. So yeah, it's certainly, there is a compelling rationale for why we need to do something in this space. And we have deployed sectoral programs into the area for a long time, and we haven't seen change. So, let's try something different. Let's give this a go and see how it works out. So I think that compelling rationale is absolutely important as well. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Bart.
It's encouraging. Thanks for that mixture of challenge and hope at the end, Jeff. We do have one question from the audience, from Rebecca, which is for us to speak specifically to an example of seeing an adaptive program that's successful and what made it successful. Well, I'm happy to speak to that. Is anybody else happy to speak to it?
Yeah, Mark, I am.
Great, Jeff.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, Andrew will be, as familiar as I am with this, but effectively in the Philippines, a program called Coalitions for Change, which Andrew mentioned, which sort of the Jaime Faustino is the sort of the leading force behind it. But it's a great example of a program that successfully has worked in this adaptive way, especially thinking and working politically. And it's it's deployed a portfolio approach that works on sort of 15 to 20 reforms at any one time. Some fail, some do okay, most actually just do okay, and a few have actually gone big. So, for instance, an example there would be, we had a reform which Jaime was leading, where he brought together a coalition of actors working on trying to get a new sin tax, a tax on alcohol and tobacco, through Congress, and they worked over a period of time and built the issue around it not being a revenue issue, but being a health issue. And they proposed that the money would be earmarked specifically to increase the health sector. And, and a lot of back and forth, is a very well-known example, but effectively, eventually got it across the line. Very, very tightly fought. A lot of interests at play, a lot of powerful interests at play, but got it across the line. And it's resulted in, billions of additional dollars being spent on healthcare as a result in the Philippines. So a very good example. Now, this is not easy. I'm not going to pretend that. So I've been working with a local organization here. We've identified some leaders who we think have capacity. We've been working with that organization to build up their knowledge and understanding of these kind of approaches. And we're now on the cusp of signing a new grant agreement with them to try and empower them and facilitate their ability to try and make these approaches work here in PNG. It's taken 3 years to get to this point, from the start to the point where we're getting to a grant agreement, in terms of building up their understanding, creating mentors, building relationships to externals who can help them in terms of the process, the analysis. It's not easy, but effectively, if you want to deal with complex problems, if you want to really make a difference in terms of development outcomes, then this is the space that we're in, and this is the kind of journey you have to take. Thanks, Bart.
That's great, Jeff. I think it's also really important to realize that largely things that are happening locally are themselves inherently adaptive. I mean, PNG is the land of the unexpected. It's one of the things that I do so love about Western provinces. You really don't know what's going to happen, and you're often surprised every day, and just how adaptive people are quickly to that. So often things, the secret here is actually bridging the gap. So there's often can be two realities emerge around a development program: the daily reality of people being adaptive and dealing with what's walking in their door and how they're responding to it and building relationships and everything that's involved, and the story that they're telling the funders, because they have to meet quite rigid KPIs and other indicators. So it's not like you need an adaptive program to get to success. It's often how do you get the programming and the funding modalities to actually wrap around where success is already occurring. Okay, so, and I think also, maybe we're starting to see, I'm hoping that we're starting to see the beginning of success in this approach in Western Province. It's very, very early days. We are continuing down DFRAD is continuing down this pathway. So in a few years' time, we'll be able to hopefully bring some more evidence to it. But as Jeff has already pointed out, just to get to this point, there's been a lot of work in a policy space, a lot of work of research, understanding the context, just getting us to this point where we are now in a position where we are confronting this question of how do we take funders with us. Okay, does anybody else in the panel wish to offer? I think Coalitions for Change is a fantastic example. Does anybody on the panel have any other successful examples that they wish to share, or if they prefer just to give us a final comment as we are getting close to the end?
I've seen a very good example with the Governance for Development program that DFAD finances in Timor-Leste. And I think some of the things that made it successful is that, for example, a lot of the advisors are actually local advisors. So the fact that they were people from the country talking with their counterparts, I think that helped create a more kind of like a trust environment. They knew each other, they understood each other. And so that was very interesting. And in fact, when the pandemic hit and like international advisors flew out, probably 80% of the program continued running smoothly. The other one was that it was adaptive in the sense that they have flexibility to change. So again, when the pandemic hit, they kind of like reprogrammed the activities, and that happened very quickly. And I think they were very successful for that. And they support the government when they needed, where they needed. And the other one was that the program had been running for a long time. So they had been 8 years and they were going for another 4. And so that kind of like gave them the opportunity to learn. And I'm sure that it wasn't perfect from the beginning, and it still isn't. But the fact that they had so much space to interact with their counterparts, I think that made it successful. And I think those are very like key elements, small changes that could be adapted into other programs that manage kind of this challenge that we were talking about between being flexible, but then manage the risk and the accountability that donors need to.
Thank you. Okay, any other, maybe you have time for 1 or 2 more final comments or examples?
Mark, maybe just to add that I think there is a growing global set of experience around adaptive programming. So in addition to the cases that we've been talking about here today, I know, DFID, FCDO, the UK government has supported adaptive programming in quite a range of places in Myanmar, state level program support in Nigeria, in Rwanda. So I think there is a real growing set, and to go to your point of hope that this is building the case for more adaptive programming, but also helping us to learn about contexts in which it's appropriate, and the kinds of ways in which we can engage to achieve those sorts of results in very different contexts. And I think, you know, what we've tried to talk a little bit about today from Western Province is how you match up the realities of a very particular place and bring some of those general lessons that we're now learning from adaptive programming about what you should do, how you should do it, what the sequence of things should be, how flexible you can be, how you think about measuring impact, all of these issues that have to be sorted out as you expand a program and you create these investments in more adaptive programming.
Thanks, Andrew. And Brian, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any concluding comments or reflections, especially from a South Fly perspective?
Yeah, Mark, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that. You know, let me just conclude this way, you know, while the programs that are coming into the communities to, you know, they have their own challenges up there at that level. And the communities also have their own challenges when people are intervening into their communities. And sometimes, you know, when there is a initiative, you know, getting into a community, what happens is that they try to work with, you know, in some instances, they try to work with what we call the change agent group, and then they think that that will be the group that's going to you know, expand the program, and it becomes sustainable over the years. However, from what I've observed and from my experience, that actually creates a problem, because then the rest of the community is seen as not going along with the change community. They become kind of the select group, and they think that they are the ones that they should lead in the community, which sometimes can go against a community as a whole. So I would think that in any intervention, one of the good measuring rod for success would be that we must not only work with the change agent group that we think will be able to lead the program, but we should also look at the whole community. And from my experience, when the whole community gets involved, you can be assured that the program is going to be a success. When it's just a faction of the community, it brings in problem later on when the program comes to an end. Because when we talk about sustainability after the end of the project, you know, that's where the real problems begin.
Thanks, Brian. I think, yeah, personally, there's a lot of people in South Fly who are really, looking for some change. So let's hope that, we can be a part of that together, continue to be a part of that together. Okay, so we're at the end now. Please do follow and stay engaged with each of the panelists today. We have at times mentioned a few authors, and we will organise, I'm sure we can organise to have those pieces of work put up on the CGD website. Thanks deeply to all of the panelists and to everybody in CGD behind the scenes to make this happen. We look forward to staying in touch and hope to come back to you in a few years' time with a progress report on how things are going in Western Province. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.